I'm a graduate student in the Viability lab at UNC Chapel Hill, and today I'm going to talk about the evolution of sexual imprinting through reinforcement. So reinforcement is the evolution of pre-mating isolation when hybrids have reduced fitness, and it is an important mechanism in speciation because when you have allopatric populations with only partial post-zygotic isolation, reinforcement allows, upon secondary contact, the completion of speciation by evolving pre-mating isolation. And there are two major models of reinforcement, the one allele model and the two allele model. In one allele model, one of the alleles leads to stronger assortative mating, and by spreading that allele, it allows reinforcement to occur. In contrast, in two allele models, for reinforcement in two allele models, the two alleles are leading to different mating tendencies, for example, different preference, and so the X and Y could be anything. And for reinforcement to occur through two allele models, you need the two alleles to be segregated into separate populations, and that is much more difficult because recombination and migration is going to obstruct that. Furthermore, you can potentially lose polymorphism, and that again is not going to facilitate reinforcement. So one example of one allele mechanism is sexual imprinting. And sexual imprinting is when it's a form of learning, and when it is a form of learning that modifies mating preference based on social experiences in early life. And one of the more common example is the most common form is females learning the mating signal of their fathers. And that is the kind we're going to focus on today. And sexual imprinting is important because it's found in a wide range of taxa. So that leads me to my research questions is, can imprinting evolve through reinforcement? And if it does the evolution of imprinting increase divergence, reduce hybridization, and help maintain polymorphism? So to answer those questions, I use population genetic models. In this model, I assume haploidy, 5 loci, each with 2 alleles, and free recombination between all of those loci. 3 of those 5 loci determines a trait in an additive manner, and there's also a preference locus and a learning locus which determines the strength of imprinting. I'll explain them in more detail in just a second. So this is an overview of the life cycle. It starts with migration, and for that I use a 2-island migration model because we're interested in secondary contact scenario with spatial structure. And then the next stage in the life cycle is viability selection, which includes selection against hybrids, divergent selection on the trait, as well as a cost on the imprinting. The next stage is sexual selection and mate choice, and that is based on the preference locus and the imprinted preference. And then the last stage in the life cycle is reproduction and paternal imprinting of those offspring on the fathers. So this is a more detailed view on the viability selection on the trait. So the way the trait is defined is the number of T1 alleles determines the trait value. And in patch A, divergent selection favors, over here, favors trait 0 over trait 1 over trait 2 over trait 3, and vice versa in patch B. And then for selection against hybrids, the 2 intermediate traits have reduced fitness compared to the 2 purebreds. Then in sexual selection, I assume it's polygyny, so sexual selection is acting on the males, and all females have the same mating success. And the female preference consists of 2 components, the innate preference, which is determined by the P locus, and the imprinted preference. And the 2 components are weighted by the imprinting strength and then combined by this equation. The imprinting strength is determined by the L locus. So for example, if lambda, the imprinting strength is 0, then the second term disappears, so you have the innate preference determining the preference, female preference. And then if lambda is 1, then this first term disappears, so it's complete imprinting. As for the cost of imprinting, the way it is implemented is that whichever allele that leads to stronger imprinting strength have its fitness reduced by a constant C. So this is the preference distributions. So for example, if an individual carries P0 allele, then the innate preference is skewed towards trait 0, and if carrying P1, then the innate preference skewed towards trait 3. And as for the imprinted preference, it depends on the father's trait. If the father has trait 0, then again the imprinted preference is skewed toward trait 0, and if the father has T1, it's peaked at T1, etc. And again, these are combined and weighted by the imprinting strength. So this model is not solvable analytically, so I use deterministic simulations to iterate through the life cycle. The starting condition is a secondary context scenario where the preference and trait loci are all diverged across patches. And as for the learning locus, I set one of the allele to be the resident allele and then see whether a mutant allele can invade and replace that resident population. So the imprinting strength of that mutant is higher or lower by 0.01 compared to the resident population. And then I tested through the entire range of imprinting strength, 100 pairs of these resident and mutants at increments of 0.01, so that's all of them, and I tested invasion from both directions. So I'm essentially looking for the stable strategy that cannot be invaded by any mutants. So this is a representative slice of the results, and on the horizontal axis is the imprinting strength, and the y-axis are various measurements. I go through them one by one. So the first thing I want you to note is that this line, which indicates the divergence of the preference locus, it is decreasing as imprinting strength increase. And the reason behind that is because as imprinting strength increase, the imprinting is masking out the effect of innate preference. So this first term is becoming less and less important. So essentially, the preference locus is becoming neutral, which is why it's losing divergence as the imprinting strength increases. The second thing is this line, which is the trait divergence. You can see it is way higher than the preference divergence. And the reason, and furthermore, even at low imprinting strength, it is still very different. And it is because the traits are under direct selection, whereas the preference is only under indirect selection through linkage disequilibrium with the trait. I'll explain that in a little more in the next slide. And this is the threshold below which polymorphism in both the trait and sometimes the preference is lost. And if the polymorphism is lost, then nothing else really matters. You just have one population. And the point is, if you go above that threshold, then you can have imprinting evolving towards this stable strategy, which is oftentimes at an intermediate level. So it is not evolving towards complete imprinting, and the reason I'll explain in more detail just a second. And the last thing is this peak of the trait divergence. So it is not located at the stable strategy, nor is it at complete imprinting. And the reason behind that is explained pretty well in that Surveillance 2011 paper. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain that today, but if you are interested, you can either read that paper or come ask me later. Okay, so first, how is the polymorphism lost? The first thing we need to remember is that the preference is less diverged than the trait. And because the preference is only under indirect selection, and what that does is the preference locus is going to pull the trait towards homogenization because of that. And then because of linkage disequilibrium between the trait and the preference, so the preference itself is also going to evolve towards homogenization, and this creates a feedback loop until you lose divergence across patches. And then because the allele frequencies are not going to be exactly 50-50, one of them is going to be more common. So whichever one that is more common is going to be favored globally by the Fisherian process. So it will evolve towards fixation, and that is why you lose polymorphism. Now, imprinted preference does not have that problem because imprinted preference is based directly on the paternal trait frequencies, so it is just as diverged as the trait frequencies. So within individual patches, the imprinted preference is going to favor a different allele since we start with secondary context scenario where the more common allele is different in each patch. So the imprinted preference is selecting for a different trait in each patch, and that maintains polymorphism. So as we increase imprinting, we are shifting from that mechanism in the previous slides towards what is happening here, the imprinting preference maintaining polymorphism. So which is why above that threshold, polymorphism is maintained. Now the next thing is this imprinting strength that evolves when polymorphism is maintained. So we know it is evolving because of reinforcement, since this line, can you see that is the light yellow line, the dotted line, it is the frequency of hybrids across all population. It is decreasing, so that indicates that reinforcement is occurring, and reinforcement should push the stable strategy up. But what is pushing it down? Well, as it turns out, we found there are two mechanisms that are pushing it down. The first is the cost of imprinting, and the other thing is that immigrant females sometimes get good genes benefit when they mate with they always get that benefit when they mate with locally adapted males, and sometimes that is strong enough to push the stable strategy down. And the reason these three forces can exactly balance out somewhere in the middle is because there's diminishing return for reinforcement. As you can see, the hybrid frequency is going lower and lower towards the right, so that means the risk of hybridization is reducing as imprinting strength is getting higher. So the benefit you can potentially get by evolving imprinting is getting lower and lower, so that's why they can balance out somewhere in the middle instead of going all the way up or all the way down. So in the moment, I'm going to show you some graphs. The horizontal axis is selection against hybrids. The vertical axis is divergent selection, and the color indicates the level of imprinting that will evolve. So that is the location of that stable strategy. There are 4 patterns observed, and the first thing is that towards the top right, where selection coefficients are high, because there are fewer surviving hybrids and immigrants around due to strong selection, there will be less risk of hybridization, so less reinforcement, and therefore lower imprinting will evolve. The next thing is towards the top left, because selection against hybrid is low, so there's not a lot of, the immigrant females are not being penalized for hybridizing with the locally adapted males. And furthermore, because divergent selection is strong, so that good genes benefit is relatively large. So because of that, there will be less imprinting evolved towards the top left. There will be 6 figures, and towards the right, the cost of imprinting is higher, and that should lead to lower imprinting. And the rows in the bottom have higher migration rate, which increases the risk of hybridization. So there should be more imprinting. So let me remove all that clutter and show you the actual graphs. So these are the results. You can see the 4 patterns. Towards the top right, strong selection, low risk of hybridization since the immigrants are not around anyway, so lower imprinting. Towards the top left, good genes benefit for immigrant females, so lower imprinting again. To the right, high cost, low imprinting. And towards the bottom, migration rate is high, which increase the risk of hybridizing with the immigrants. So again, the imprinting strength will evolve to a higher level. So the take-home message is first, imprinting does evolve, but it doesn't always evolve towards complete imprinting. It often evolves to somewhere in the middle. And the evolution of imprinting reduces hybridization, it reduces the divergence of innate preference, and it does not maximize trait divergence. And with that, I'll take any questions.